or we can. Ah, nice. So then I will hand over to you, Marion, and I'm excited to talk.
Yes. Okay. I'm gonna share my screen. Just one moment. Okay.
Perfect.
Yeah, you can see it. Perfect. Okay, so first of all, like hello everyone, and super happy to be here again and see that this event is back in Berlin, and I hope to meet you all in person soon. I am an accessibility designer working at Futurize. What I define as an accessibility designer is someone that focuses on building accessible designs. So hopefully preventing accessibility issue from happening in the design phase, but also this is someone that would be interested in implementing accessible practices that matches the company scales and organization. And about my company, Futurize, it's a consultancy that provides expertise in strategy, design, engineering, and data. And yeah, this talk, as you mentioned in the introduction, it has been inspired by my work with my project team. We are 12 awesome designers that are trying to deliver the best for our clients who has a big mobile application. And to deliver the best for our client, at some point, it meant also introducing an accessibility checklist. And what we've been doing for over a year is, from the one side, using the checklist, but also trying to improve it over time with our client. So in this talk, what you will learn is what are accessibility checklists. I'm pretty sure you have already an idea, but let's start with the beginning. And then we can talk why are they useful, at least from my point of view, how to implement them in your process, which I think is the most important part of this talk, and what are their limits. Okay, so let's jump into the what. There's no clear definition what accessibility checklists are from the Oxford dictionary, or I don't know what's great dictionary reference. So I just came up with my own definition, which is tools to evaluate the extent to which an element meets your accessibility requirements. And yeah, nowadays, accessibility checklists seems to be quite fashionable, because you will find various checklists from many different types of organizations, including consultancies. So I have this example from Intopia, for instance, the accessibility not checklist. But you can also find those checklists being released by product companies. I have this example from Webflow or Vox Media, which is more a brand. And then you can find also individual or open source projects that deliver accessibility checklists. So you might be aware of the A11Y project doing also their checklists, as well as government entities. So for instance, the University of Birmingham and many other government entities. And with the spread of these accessibility checklists, we also start to hear praise, but also criticism. So this one I'm taking from Sherry Bernhaber in her article called Accessibility Checklists Just Say No. She is stating there, general accessibility checklists containing all WCAG 2.1 level AA guidelines should not be used and should never be used in an organization trying to achieve accessibility maturity. So in this talk, I would try to understand why this criticism. But from my point of view, I can already tell you in my experience that it's coming more from how the accessibility checklist is crafted and used rather than the method itself. And to justify my point, I'm going to talk a little bit about the why I think accessibility checklists are useful. I see several opportunities there. I'm going to go through each of them one by one. And the first one is, if we start from a compliance point of view, very pragmatic one, you're trying to achieve the compliance on a AA level a AA level, and this means you have to implement or to respect 50 different success criterion. And it's a lot of information to memorize and integrate systematically to your workflow, especially if you have never learned about that before. So there is a very pragmatic way of thinking about this. Another way would be that it provides a way for designer to assess their designs. So automated tools to check accessibility are actually very limited in the design realm. And in this case, checklists can provide guidance to perform manual check and empower designers to solve accessibility issues or prevent them from happening at a later stage of the process, where basically, I mean, maybe you're aware of this shift left model, which states that the longer you keep the accessibility issue or any bug in your process, the most expensive it would be to fix it. So actually, I think a lot of problems could be avoided at the design stage, but we need to empower designer to uncover and prevent accessibility issue from happening. And here, kind of related to that, comes the third point, which is to transfer knowledge about accessibility to your teams. Many people in the tech are not trained on accessibility and have very little or basic knowledge of the topic. So learning to work with accessibility checklists can help them integrate accessibility standards in their practices, especially if they receive the support from accessibility experts, so that they can integrate all the exceptions or best practices beyond the success criterion. And then the last point would be to track your progress with accessibility. So here, it really depends how you integrate this checklist in your process. But basically, one way of thinking about that is that if you document the outcome of the check, you can track accessibility issues and at which stage they are solved. And beyond that, if you see that some issues are always coming up, then maybe it's a red flag that you should investigate one of your process or how you're framing a requirement, because maybe it's not well understood. So it's also something that can help you iterate on your process and your tool. Okay, so I have covered the why, and now I'm jumping into the biggest part of this presentation, which is the how. And because it's the biggest part, I'll try to go step by step. So if you're starting to create an accessibility checklist, it's likely you will try to do it from a compliance point of view, which means basically taking the WCAG requirements and turning them into, or taking the WCAG success criterion and turning them into your requirements. And I'm saying here, you need to adapt the WCAG requirements, and to understand why, I'm going to take this example from the success criterion 2.3.3, which states motion animation triggered by interaction can be disabled unless the animation is essential to the functionality or the information being conveyed. So maybe if there are a lot of people here who are familiar with the WCAG, it seems very innocent to you. But when you're reading this for the first time and you're not aware of all those guidelines, it can be very confusing because of technical wording, or also because of the length of the sentence. And that's why the checklist kind of need this translation to happen in order to make them actionable. But how people translate it is where it's starting to become interesting. So this is an example of how this success criterion has been translated for the Webflow accessibility checklist. And it states, avoid parallax effect. So here you can see how the translation is bringing kind of a new dimension that can seem quite restrictive, especially to web designers, because it's telling them that they should not do certain practices. We know that, I think, from doing accessibility consultation or sparring in your different organization, you know this when your designers look at you and are, but can't we really do this? Because, yeah, of course, they are feeling frustrated and they don't necessarily understand why. But on the other hand, we see here that the original success criterion is not exactly adapted, like that it is really taking a specific direction where it could have had a different way of handling the criterion. Especially if you look at the recommended techniques, you would see that providing an alternative motion or a way of disabling the motion would have been enough. Nevertheless, this is kind of Webflow's decision. And here my stance is to say that checklists are interpretation of the WCAG anyway. So if Webflow for their specific service and product and team and way of working think that this is the way of translating this criterion that best work for them, I would say that's okay. The only thing is that it becomes dangerous when another company comes and is like, okay, me too, I'm gonna make my accessibility checklist and I'm going to copy over all the things from Webflow without really trying to understand the source of all of the source where this requirement is coming from. So that's why one recommendation that I would always give is be careful when you want to reuse something online to craft your own checklist, especially if it's not the original WCAG success criteria. Here, I always like to recommend checking the quick reference because I think the way the information is laid out here is a little bit easier to scan than the original documentation. And this resource is also provided by the Y initiative. Another thing that I can recommend is explain why your requirement matters so that you enable the empathy from other people, especially designers who are also supposed to have this empathy. So actually the Webflow checklist, they do this. You can see below the criteria, they explain this type of motion is harmful to people with vestibular disorders and should be avoided or used with extreme caution and restraint. So that way you have a better understanding why they're taking this or why they're making this requirement. And it's a great way of clarifying the purpose and avoiding misinterpretations. And by the way, if you go into the more detailed version of this requirement, they also provide the success criterion reference of the requirement, which I also recommend as a good practice here, because then anyone in your team can start to investigate where the requirement comes from. And this can create also discussion about the requirement itself, which probably is going to lead to a better understanding of the requirement. So here I took this first example, but now I'm going to take again the example that Mark has very well already talked about, which is great because it's going to make it easy for me. So in this second example, I'm taking again the first success criterion. I'm reading it out loud now. So all non-text content that is presented to the user has a text alternative that serves the equivalent purpose, except for the situations listed below. So here we see in this different example that the criterion will cover or try to cover several situation or use cases. What my purpose is here, I'm just going to focus on the use case of having an image that needs a text alternative. And I'm going to take 3 examples from 3 different checklists. What is interesting at first sight is that none of them is saying the same, but let's compare them more in detail. So one is saying images should have meaningful alternative text. This first example is very broad, and yeah, after the presentation from Mark, we can agree that this is not really conveying the subtleties of this requirement, especially because it gives the feeling that all images should have a meaningful alternative text, when we know now that it should be only the one that are conveying a meaning that is not conveyed through text. Now, if we take the second example, it says image elements have an alt attribute. And here it's thought like a very technical thing. This requirement, it really refers to HTML tags and alt attributes inside HTML. So in a way, it's much more precise. It's focusing heavily on a technology. And that means also that this cannot work for every product. So I mentioned I'm working on a mobile app. We don't have images and alt attributes in the technology we use. So that's also like how this can create some sort of limitations. But it's also very broad, and it can also be misinterpreted, because here again, it gives the impression that all images should have an alt attribute, but it could be empty, or it could be filled with a lot of text. It's not very clear. And then the third example is informative images have alt text, decorative images don't. None of those examples are perfect, but this one is probably the most complete because it's really showing the difference between what should have an alternative text and what should not. But again, it might give the feeling that decorative images should have any alternative text when they should have only an empty one. It doesn't convey this information. So what we learned from those 3 examples is that wording matters. And when crafting a checklist, we have to be mindful that we might broaden or limit the meaning of original WCAG success criteria. So another thing that this means for me is that usually one criterion will never be described by only one requirement. You would need several requirements to actually carry the full meaning of the criterion. An example I can give here is this checklist from This is WCAG, where they have at least 7 criterion just to cover, 7 requirements just to cover the first criterion. Another thing that is worth noting is that it's important to distinguish between the criterion itself and the way you adapt it. One question we can ask ourselves is, what are the concrete to-dos? So we tend, when we create those checklists, to really focus on like enforcing the criterion. But from my experience, I think those requirements, they should maybe more focus on what are the practices we want to establish that would respect those criterion instead. One example I can give, or one good practices would be to provide example that illustrates your requirements. So for instance, the IBM Equal Access Toolkit, for this specific criteria, they provide example how the design should be annotated depending on the different cases. And yeah, I think this basically summarize my recommendation for crafting the checklist itself. A structure that I think is quite good would include the requirement, the rationale, an example to show like what practice you want to adapt, and the source where the requirement is coming from. Okay, so now we talk about crafting the checklist, and another important step that comes next is shaping the checklist. And to start with this one, I will quote one of the designer on my team that I interviewed some months ago that stated, "I feel overwhelmed with this endless table." We work on Confluence, so you get it. Having everything on one page makes it difficult to focus on the relevant topics. So one thing we can learn from this right away is we need to provide ways to filter the checklist so that people can directly access what they need. This might seem obvious, but what is less obvious is how do we do this? And usually checklists tend to divide their requirement by topic. So the example I can bring here is the one from the A11Y project, where they have this nice table of content where you can find items like keyboard, images, heading, and for each of those sections, you would have all the requirements that are listed. Fine, but in our case, and when I got this feedback from the designer, we were already doing this, and we still got this feedback. So it seems that this way of dividing the information, even if it's necessary, it's not enough to reduce the cognitive load. So what are other ways of dividing the information that I can think about? One would be by role. So here I can give this example from the Vox Media accessibility checklist, which is dividing the requirements by designers, engineers, project managers, QA, and editorial. And to be honest, I'm not so sure about this approach. I have two reasons that, makes me hesitate a little bit with this one. One would be that even inside companies, roles can vary a lot within different teams. So you can never ensure that you have a consistent share of the responsibility. And the second is you take the risk to leave a responsibility only to one role, when I think each role should receive a piece of the responsibility. And if we take the example again of the alternative text, it's actually really hard to assess who should be in charge of this. Vox Media, in their checklist, they kind of escape this problem by duplicating the requirements to the different roles. But I think one way we could strategize around this or share this responsibility could be like this, for instance. You could have like a content strategist checklist that says something like, when information is conveyed through image only, provide a short description of the information. Then you could have something for different from the designer checklist that would be ensure accessible name, convey the information necessary to the user in a concise way. So here you see that this requirement is much more emphasizing on the usability of the experience, because this is the responsibility of the designer. And then finally, the checklist of the developer could be more about making sure that the accessible names that are documented are correctly implemented. Which leads me to a third way of dividing the information that could be actually by process. And here it's something that would be much more tailored to the organization. It's kind of something I thought about when I was working on accessibility annotation for my project. And I realized that in our process, some annotations were really relevant in a contextual way. So when you are in a specific flow, doing something specific, you need to be clear about your intention as a designer that is going to hand over to your developers, for instance. But there are other things that you can take care of in another team. Namely, if you have like a design system team, they have a lot of things that they can take care of at the scale of the component, while there are some things that are completely out of their control because it depends on the feature teams and how they use the components. So an example how this could work would be to say that design system team ensure that images have alt attributes, while feature team documents alternative text for images who don't have any textual equivalent, but still bearing some importance, conveying some important meaning. Which is leading me to the third part, which is using the checklist. And here I can gather some recommendations, some tips. The first one would be don't do accessibility checks alone. Accessibility checks are like design or code review. You need a fresh pair of eyes to do it. So yeah, on our side, how we do it is that we are always two people. The one who needs the accessibility check will ask for a review. And then there is the person who is doing the check and who is then in charge of checking the requirements. And then the person who requested the check, who is more in charge of the feature. So the person doing the check will ask, okay, can we take a look at your graphics or visual elements? And then the other person who knows where everything is, because they have been doing this for a while, will point to the element, and then they can check whether an alternative text is needed or not. And one thing I want to add here is that many other companies, they do accessibility review at the design stage, but you can also find accessibility check at different stage. And of course, you shouldn't do accessibility checks only at a specific stage. The other tip would be document the outcome of your accessibility check. I already explained a little bit why in the beginning, but I can also give another reason. That would be that it's important to ensure a proper handover with your dev team. So documenting the outcome on a project management tool, or by having just an informal meeting with your dev team is a very important thing to do to ensure that there's not a misunderstanding. Third tip would be train people to use the accessibility checklist, because yes, if you don't train the people, they might misinterpret the requirements or the WCAG guidelines or the practice you want to create. So in our team, what we do is that, first of all, like when you're joining Futurize, you would get training, an introduction on accessibility and disability independent of the project you will join after. And then in our project, we have like a onboarding when we go through our checklist, and yeah, we cover all the examples of the checklist and the practices that are necessary with the new joiner. This is the moment where the new joiner can ask all the questions they might have. And then we recommend the new joiner to have at least 3 accessibility checks with the accessibility expert of the team, so that they can gather a more hands-on experience of using the checklist. And yeah, last but not least, update the checklist when necessary. So this is a tool, but it's also a living document. From a compliance point of view, we can see this case coming that, for instance, WCAG 2.2 is on its way, and this will bring a new update to your tool when it is released because of additional success criterion or modification of current success criteria. So yeah, you need to make sure that this is integrated. But also from a usability point of view, you could add requirement based on the outcome of usability test, especially if you are testing with people who have disabilities or who are using specific assistive technology repetitively. You might see pattern emerge, and then you can integrate that to your good practices. So yeah, to summarize this part, I'd say that it's important to establish processes to guide people in using the checklist. And we're reaching the conclusion. My takeaways are: an accessible checklist is an interpretation. Oh, an accessibility checklist, sorry. It's also an accessible checklist. Anyway, and yeah, be aware when you're crafting your own, prefer the WCAG sources to start creating your requirements, even if it doesn't prevent you from looking at how other organizations do it. The second one would be, it mostly enforces compliance, but it can also work with usability, depending on how you are updating your living document and working with it. My third one would be, use them to share the responsibility of accessibility in your organization instead of focalizing all the responsibility to one department or role. Train your team, or they won't use it successfully or at all. And it's not enough to establish the topic in your company to craft an accessibility checklist. And here I'm coming back to the quote from Sherry Bernhaber. Having an accessibility checklist will not be enough to implement accessibility practices in your organization. As I mentioned, it's just a tool. Then we need process, and then you need also strategy to become efficient and scale this up. And thank you. I don't know if we have time for questions, but if you don't, you can follow up with me on Twitter. My handle is Marion Couesnon, MARIONCOUESNON. And yeah, thank you again for your attention, and to the Ali Berlin team for bringing this event back.
Thanks a bunch, Marion. We had indeed one question in the chat already from Nasia. What is your opinion on the